חשיבות ההסברה ועל זה שהקול של ישראל לא מספיק נשמע. ואחד הקולות שכן מייצגים אותנו הוא דווקא לא יהודי ולא ישראלי. קוראים לו דאגלס מארי. הוא סופר, עיתונאי בריטי, שהתגובות שלו לגבי האמירות על פרופורציה ברשתות הבריטיות התהדו גם כאן. דאגלס מארי, hi, good morning. Thank you for joining us.
Good morning. It's a great pleasure to be with you.
Great having you here with us. So first of all, you became one of the most identified speakers, journalists supporting Israel's action. Its right to respond to Hamas crimes. First of all, I assume you received lots of comments from Israelis. Thank you for that.
I did, and it's profoundly moving to me. All I've tried to do since the Hamas massacres of 2 weeks ago is to tell the truth and to try to remind people in Britain and the wider West of who the aggressors are here. And I'm amazed at the response of so many people, Jews in the diaspora and of course Israelis, and I'm very, very touched by it. But at the same time, I'm alarmed by it because all that I've said is all that I think any decent non-Jew observer of the situation should see and say. And I am genuinely ashamed and shocked by the response of so many people, the silence of so many people outside Israel to these atrocities. They gave minutes to the atrocities themselves and then went straight on to Israel's response. I think it shows not a problem for Israel, but a problem for countries like the country I'm from, Britain, and many other countries in the West.
Douglas, more than once you've been asked, especially by the British media, regarding Israel's actions and if they were proportionate, as you mentioned. Why do you think they're so obsessed, someone may say, to the term?
It is extraordinary. As I've repeatedly pointed out to the British and other media, they are obsessed with this idea of proportionality in conflict, but only when it comes to Israel responding to Hamas or to any other enemy of Israel. My own view is that, of course, proportionality in conflict is a total nonsense. As I've pointed out in several interviews, proportionate response in this case would be Israel going and decapitating precisely the same number of babies that Hamas decapitated, or going into Gaza and abducting and raping precisely the same number of women that Hamas raped. Of course, Israel wouldn't do that. But the whole idea is an obscenity that you can only respond proportionately to such barbarism. Of course, Britain and other countries, when we've had conflicts, we exercise restraint and skill as Israel does. But I think that the whole idea that Israel has to be lectured about proportionality is really just an attempt by countries who are friends of Israel, but also have domestic problems if they are too friendly to Israel, to say effectively to Israel, you're allowed to do something in the face of such horror, but do fight with one arm behind your back, won't you? You know, be good chaps. And I think that's outrageous from an ally.
And you also said in the past that Israel is the only country that isn't allowed to win. Could you explain that?
Yes. Yes, absolutely. In my view, and I've covered wars involving Israel as I have wars across the rest of the world for a couple of decades now. And what I'm always stunned by in whether it's with the exchanges in Gaza or wherever else, is that the international community says to Israel, you know, you have an aggressor who attacks you. You're allowed to do something in response that effectively gets you to the status quo just before the moment you were attacked, but nothing more, which means that Israel has this endless continuing threat. And my view is that the Gaza situation since 2005 has been intolerable. Unfortunately, Israelis and others have tolerated the situation, have tolerated the rockets. But why should Israel have had to tolerate the rockets? We would not have had to tolerate the rockets in Britain if they'd been coming from a neighbor
Douglas,
on a...
Let me ask you, why do you believe the word sympathy is still very much on the Palestinian side, despite the atrocities committed by Hamas? And is there any explanation but anti-Semitism?
There are explanations. I fear that anti-Semitism lurks beneath many of them, if not most. Essentially, you also have to remember that there is a generation of particularly young people who are profoundly ignorant about the whole history of Israel since 1948, and indeed the history of the Jewish peoples in the land of Israel for 3,000 years. There is a type of college graduate who thinks they know everything about the world, and in particular, they think the world can be divided into the colonizer and the colonized. And there are so many bits of ignorance in this, but they've made the Palestinians the underdog. They believe that they should be on the side of all underdogs. They believe the Israelis are somehow incredibly dominant over the dogs in the region, rather than the one country there protecting itself against all the neighboring borders. And these people now believe that these ignoramuses believe their job in life is to attack Israel and to lie about Israel, and that somehow they're doing good in the world. It's a grotesque distortion of reality. And it's a terrible, terrible indictment of the education system in the West, that we've produced a generation of people so fantastically ignorant and in the end bigoted.
And a personal note, we think you've done an amazing job explaining the Israeli side and the logic behind the Israel's actions. So how can we change it?
Well, my view is that Israel needs to look after itself, and that far too many people outside of Israel talk about what Israel should or should not do. My view is that people like me in countries like Britain, although I travel the world all the time, need to keep our own houses in order. And it's not right that British politicians lecture Israelis or American politicians lecture Israelis when within 24 hours of the massacres in Israel the other week, I was in Times Square, New York, and there were pro-Hamas demonstrators there. I'm not interested in hearing American politicians lecture Israel when they can't keep New York in order. Same thing with Britain. I'm not interested in hearing British politicians saying exactly what tactics they believe that Israel should use in the Gaza when they have no knowledge of it anyway, when they can't keep their own streets in order. On Saturday in Britain, we saw up to 100,000 radicals marching through the streets of London, flying the flags of banned Islamic and Islamist organizations. We saw British people told by the British police not to fly the flag of England. I'm sorry, but in this situation, Israel can look after itself, and it's very good at doing so. But countries like Britain and the rest of the West need to realize we have a problem at home now, which is being exposed, which I've written about for years in my books and in my articles. We need to look to our own backyards before we lecture the Israelis. And I hope that that lesson is learned.
Former Prime Minister of Israel, Bennett, has tweeted yesterday following his interview, let's call it the interview on BBC, if you think London is far away, you're dead wrong. Your moral weakness invites these monsters to attack you. Do you agree?
Absolutely. I watched that interview, Naftali Bennett, with great interest. The BBC interviewer did the classic thing, mentioned Hamas very briefly, and then immediately starts asking for reassurances that the Israelis aren't going to deliberately target Palestinian children and all of this sort of thing. I thought he handled it exceptionally well. Israel is very lucky to have a lot of very good spokespeople, I have to say, in the country. Unfortunately, media like the BBC, they are intrinsically anti-Israel. A report found this some years ago within the BBC, an internal report, and was suppressed as a result. So we've never actually been allowed to read the report into anti-Israel bias at the BBC. But these organizations like the BBC show their own ignorance, their own bias. Israelis, I think, should pay some attention to that. But not an infinite amount. You know, in the end, you have to differentiate between a critic and an enemy. And a critic is somebody who genuinely wants to improve you, and an enemy is somebody who doesn't. A lot of foreign media is simply antagonistic towards Israel. It is not trying to improve Israel or improve Israeli military performance or actions. It's hoping that at best there'll be a draw. Israelis have to suck up the massacre of their own citizens in a way that no other country would be expected to do. And that's what entities like the BBC expect, when they're not just lying, of course, as the BBC, New York Times and others did about the hospital strike the other day. So I think some attention needs to be paid to some of the media, but a lot just needs to be written off. There is significant swathes of the media in the West who are just totally morally warped. Maybe when this comes closer to their own home, as it has in Israel, they'll change their own morals back to a firmer and finer place. I hope so.
By the way, did you receive any threats for your support in Israel?
Oh, I receive threats all the time, and I don't give a damn.
Seems like it.
Douglas Murray, thank you so much for joining us and for the Hasbara, we call it here in Israel. Thank you so much.
It's my honor. It's my honor.